Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight we're going to discuss Led Zeppelin's album in a generalized way, Houses of the Holy, because baby, it is the 50th anniversary for that album. Can you believe half a century has passed since the release of this album? Now, before I get into it, just a quick reminder, if you enjoy the video tonight, please give it a thumbs up. That helps the channel and I always appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed, all you have to do is hit that subscribe to the tribe button and baby, you're there. All right, so what I thought I would do is discuss this album in a little bit different way than I have in the past. I'll leave a link in the description box, of course, and at the end of this video, it'll be one of the videos that you can choose to watch after you've watched this, if you haven't seen that one. Now, what I mean by discussing this album in a slightly different way, unlike the video in my description box, which is basically a track-by-track analysis of that album, I wanted to discuss this album tonight in a slightly different way. First of all, I wanted to bring up the album cover. If you noticed, I put a banner over the young lady's hiney, and the reason is we live in a totally different world than we did when this album came out. When this album came out, folks, this was no big deal. No, we had our fair share of weirdos who, I'm sure, got their trolleys and their jollies off the track over this album. But this was a time period where your average young mother wouldn't feel, well, uncomfortable breastfeeding her child at a rock concert or at a get-together. It was a different time, and often you'd see children, both sexes, walking around in the parks buck naked. Now, they didn't go out and get a bunch of children to shoot this album cover. They got a male model and they got a female model. And they took several shots, inserting them into various aspects of the total picture. I almost want to say painting. And then when you open this album to the inner gatefold, you see a fully grown man holding above his head, highly, a woman as they've reached the summit, I guess, of what's on the front cover. Now, I've heard people translate that inner gatefold sleeve as being a man offering a woman up for a sacrifice at some evil dark castle. I've never saw it that way, and those are usually the people who complain and bitch about the front cover as being inappropriate, right? How about taking a look at it this way? The front cover is the beginning of the story. There are children, naked, innocent, right? Trying to reach the summit. Now, when you open up the front, you get the full picture, right? And to me, that picture always translated as children growing up, ascending to adulthood. When you turn the inner sleeve in, you have two children, because actually there were only two children to begin with, right? Fully grown. A man holding the woman up over his head. I always saw this as a demonstration of his strength as a male, and the two of them being united. But weirdos abound on the internet, and there are all kinds of weird theories about this. Now, it's very interesting here. This wasn't the first album cover artwork submitted for the album. The head of the company that developed this album actually developed the very first album cover, which I can't believe it was a tennis court, and he said he developed that because the music sounded like a bunch of racket to it. Well, he was taken off the project immediately, and artists who understood the band better started to work. Now, another thing, this album has always reminded me of one of my very favorite old-timey science fiction movies, the original Time Machine from 1961. The children, to me, look like the very same humans that the time traveler would encounter thousands of years into the future. Nothing more than fodder for the deadly Morlocks. So maybe that's what attracted me to this album. Now, I had already heard tons of Led Zeppelin material. Like I've said many times in my videos, I went to a lot of parties, folks, and I knew their songs just by what was played at those parties. They'd put these records on, play them from end to end, turn them over and play from end to end, choose another Led Zeppelin album, and we were on our way for 4 to 6 hours at a time, right? But I hadn't, up until the release of this album, actually gone down and bought myself a Led Zeppelin album. I've explained that. I was originally a Beatles fan, and they represented for me at that time period as a little too jarring of a change in direction for my musical ears. But I gotta tell you, I got the message quick, and I bought this album. Maybe due to the cover, I don't really remember, but I spent the next year and a half listening to that album probably daily, and I felt like I was transformed. Now, Led Zeppelin's studio discography is represented by 9 albums, and that's interesting because exactly 1/3 of them were experimental albums. All right, obviously Led Zeppelin 3 going that light and heavy approach, a lot more light than a lot of fans were comfortable with, and that was Led Zeppelin purposefully trying to achieve a more balanced band sound for their fans. Of course, In Through the Outdoor is another experimental album, probably due to the fact that both Jimmy and Bonzo weren't at their best when they recorded this album. A fantastic album, like I've said many times. Led Zeppelin, you've got 9 studio albums, a couple of live albums, and there is not a clunker among them. But the 3rd album that was a bit of an experiment was Houses of the Holy. Now think of just how far Led Zeppelin had traveled by this point. First of all, their first introduction album had some slam-in-your-face, almost heavy metal music to offer, but there was a lot of it that was quite traditional in its approach, and the second album solidified them as a hard-rocking, kick-ass band with just a couple of tracks that hinted elsewhere. It was the 3rd album where Led Zeppelin finally said, and Jimmy said, enough. I want to go with this whole envisionment that I had from the beginning. And so we got a more even-handed approach. Actually, a lot of people think a little heavy-handed on the so-called lighter material. I love that album. They then took everything they had learned in their first 3 albums and put it together as, well, what most people would consider their very favorite album, and it was number 1 on my list for a while as well. And of course, that album was commonly known as Led Zeppelin 4 or Zoso or 4 Symbols, depending on what part of the country and the world you were in when you first heard the album. So where was Led Zeppelin to go next? You know, out of all of Led Zeppelin's albums, this album was the album the band took the most time to develop. They recorded so much material for this album that more than one track from this album they had set up to be released would find its way on their wonderful Physical Graffiti album, their double album, and to my mind, the second greatest double album of all time, only being beaten by the Beatles' White Album. But it wasn't just the time involved. Part of that time was because they had difficulty getting the right album cover, but they purposefully spent more time. And a couple of the members actually had recording setups in their own private homes, each one developing what they would take into this album. You see, I think this album is the grown-up version of Led Zeppelin 4, in a way. And it's also one of those albums, and you've heard me talk about this in the past, there are certain albums, I just mentioned this on Royce in the House, go to his channel, he's wonderful, but I just mentioned when I was a guest host over there, that I think there are certain albums, and of course I was talking about Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, my 3rd favorite band of all time, and how it was almost a symphony. Not that there was necessarily a symphony following the band on that album, it was its symphonic presence, its symphonic approach, and when you listen to it, you have to almost listen to it from track 1 all the way to the very end. Now, I can name several albums like that. Abbey Road by the Beatles, and of course, the one symphonic album that Led Zeppelin put out, Houses of the Holy. You know, this album is the first time that Led Zeppelin really utilized the studio to its best, actually several studios, when you consider that a lot of these tracks were put together at homes, and then the Rolling Stones mobile recording studio, some of these tracks being investigated while they were still at Headley. We see Led Zeppelin go from where they were to what they are on this album. And basically, folks, this is my favorite Led Zeppelin album of all time. You know, I just saw V over on Zepp Earl. Zepp Earl is a fantastic channel, and this man is tied into Led Zeppelin. He's got recordings of them playing live and everything else. Man, this guy takes it to a whole new level, and he brought up an interesting point. He's not one to rank albums. I am, but he's not. And yet, he's still highly recommended this album. By the way, folks, if you haven't had a chance to get over there, he supported this channel right along, and I appreciate it, V. Thank you. So if you get a chance, and I'll put that in my description box, a link to Zepp Earl's channel. The man knows what he's talking about. But this is the album full of time signature changes, sometimes several times within one song. Again, you'll have to see my track-by-track analysis. But it's not just that. It's also, there is a unified feel to this album, as most great, truly great symphonic albums have. And for any album to still be popular as this album is a half a century later, that tells you it has staying power, folks. You know, if you haven't listened to this album from beginning to end in a long time, I highly recommend you do so. And let me know what you think of it after doing so. Or if you're someone who has listened to this album pretty regularly over the years, I want to hear your thoughts on this album as well. All right, folks, I'm Michael Noland. This is The Bottom Line. And together, folks, we are the tribe. We shall make a difference. All right, I'll see you in my next video.